Well, thanks very much for the welcome, Peter, and I'd like to welcome you to Morling College. So this has been my home ground. I've been here for 20 years actually. I'm on home service leave next year, and I really enjoy being in this place. I love the journeying with people in theology and thinking about the Bible. So when Peter came and saw me probably about 3 months ago, I guess it was, we sat down and had a chat. He wanted to know whether I'd be prepared to present something, to offer something to a group like ISCAST. And so I said to him, yes, I'd love to do that, and looking forward to some questions and answers towards the end of the evening as well. So I've entitled this The Divine Tapestry, Genesis and Creation Through Theological Eyes. And as you can probably imagine, we could spend the whole semester or a whole year talking about this subject because it's a huge topic. But I want to touch on some things that might be helpful for your thinking, and also give you some questions that you might ask me or one another, and hopefully we can come up with some answers and some responses as well. So I called it the Divine Tapestry because it reflects a conviction that I have that the nature of being human and the nature of the cosmos in which we exist is a kind of tapestry, and tapestry is something that someone makes. And if you've seen tapestries, I was in Paris a number of years ago and went to a museum where there were some beautiful tapestries, and you could see, even though I didn't know the creator, you could see something of their imprint on the tapestry that they had created. I'm a musician in another part of my life, and I'm constantly playing pieces of music which are like tapestries. I can see the imprint of the composer, and the imprint is different depending on the particular composer. If you play enough pieces of one particular composer, you'll see that imprint coming up in different ways, in different forms, through the music that they've created. The created world is a tapestry to me, and it has the imprint of a creator God. But how people understand creator God, what a creator God is, what a creator God looked like, what a creator God did, varies depending on one's perspective. Alongside that, I hold the conviction that our faith can and ought to be in dialogue with other disciplines, other academic disciplines, other pursuits in life. And I believe that because mutual inclusivity, as I like to call it, is a really valuable activity to be involved in. On the other hand, mutual exclusivity can reinforce ignorance, hostility, and even at times the weaponising of ideas against one another that were never intended to be used that way. So rather than viewing faith and science as something that's diametrically opposed, which I know some people do, I think it's much more helpful to see them as conversation. And as they converse with one another, and as we enter into that conversation, I think we can enrich the experience of both people of faith and people of science, and people who are people of faith and science together. And so they're the sort of basic convictions, I guess, that I have come to a talk like this tonight. The other thing I want to say as I begin is that I present tonight as a theologian. I'm not a scientist. I'm a biblical scholar, more particularly. And so the things that I present will come from a theological and a biblical scholarship perspective. I'm one who has worked with the biblical text and with the original languages for many years now, and I've thought long and hard about the relevance of this ancient text that we have to our faith and our world today. That doesn't, of course, make me infallible in my interpretations of the Bible, nor do my views reflect the whole gamut of theological and biblical views of a subject like creation and Genesis. In fact, there are those who would stand here tonight alongside me and disagree with any of the things that I will say. But it's a conversation, as I said. It's something where we need to speak and listen and hear the different perspectives. So I want to speak to the topic as a theologian and one who seeks to foster a great conversation between the discipline of theology and other disciplines in the humanities, and of course beyond the humanities as well. So where I want to start was with what I call the strangeness of the text. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. It's Genesis 1 verse 1 in Hebrew. En arche oisen othechos ton ranon kai tegein. It's Genesis 1:1 in Greek, from the Septuagint. In principio, creavat Deus caelum et terram. It's the Latin logos. Something perhaps a little more. In the beginning, God created the heaven. It's not in this time. It's how it is in the and the earth. King James Version 16. The reason I've done that is just to remind us that Genesis may not be as familiar to us as we may think. The Bible may not be as familiar to us as we may think. And I find with my students, I'm often reminding them of this is a very foreign text in many ways. We have a proliferation of English translations, as you know, and many of them are very, very good. But it's easy for us to forget this is, in fact, a very strange text from another time and another place. It's also really important, I think, for us to remember that for much of history, Bible, biblical texts have not been read by the general thinkers. They've actually been heard. They've been sung, they've been chanted, they've been spoken. In the Orthodox tradition, even today, the main way of apprehending the text is actually through iconography. So they will see the biblical text in the form of icons. So for us today, when we pick up the Bible and open it and read it, we need to just bear those things in mind. This is a foreign text that was not written in languages anything like English, and it was not written in a time such as ours today. A little bit of a personal background which might help you to understand how I've come on a journey over many years. So this is me and my mum in 1974. Not really, but kind of what we long. In 1974, I was in year 7. Do the figures for a help. But I was in year 7, and our teacher asked us to do a project on the origins of human life. And so I went home as a, who I was, 12-year-old. I said to my mum, I need to do a project on the origins of human life. So she very quickly said, right, we need to go to the Christian bookshop. So off we went, and we looked through the shelves, we brought back a whole bundle of books on the origins of human life. And we read all of that, and I wrote my project and submitted it. Now, when I read those books as a child, I realise now that they were suggesting that we read Genesis creation stories very literally, very concretely. They were not opposed to science as such. There was some conversation about science and creation. But I certainly read the text or approached the text in very idiosyncratic ways. It only emerged years later that my purview of theology at that time, not that I recalled it as a child, my theology of Genesis was actually quite narrow. I had a very narrow view. In case you're wondering what happened, I submitted the project, got a good mark for it. The teacher said I didn't agree with anything you said, but it was very well written. With something, so I was quite encouraged. Fast forward to 1987, and I'd begun to do some ministry in the church, and I thought at the time, if I'm going to do ministry in the church, it would be a good idea to get some training, some education, ministry training, some theological education. So I came to Theological College, and it was a life-changing experience because I began to realise that there was a whole world out there of how people approached biblical text, how they understood it in different ways and interpreted it in different ways. Some of the perspectives I never encountered before, I never even imagined existed, but my mind was expanded. Then I realised that actually, over more than 2 millennia, the Judeo-Christian tradition has wrestled with the interpretation of the biblical text. This wasn't a new thing. And of course, as you know, I'm sure, it continues today. People continue to wrestle over how we interpret texts like Genesis, but of course many other texts in the Bible. And my discovery led me to ask what I would call the why questions rather than the how questions. So back in 1974, my mum, probably more than me, was concerned about how did creation come about? How did God do this? And Genesis was the answer. And I guess truth was not there. Genesis was the answer in that sense for me at that time. I began to be more interested in the whys rather than necessarily have to establish the facts. For a few more years, 2002, 2003, and 2 years in a row I found myself attending lectures. The first year was by Arthur Peacock and the second year by John Polkinghorne. You might have heard of those names. They were very interesting people to me because they were both clergymen, they were both theologically trained to a very high level, but they were also scientists, bona fide scientists. And in listening to them, I guess the main idea that they wanted to convey was that faith and science could be a conversation and they could inform one another rather than being, as I said earlier, diametrically opposed and sometimes weaponised against one another. And so I read some of the material and I've read others since. Francis Collins comes to mind as an example of people who have thought in this space of where faith and science might interact with each other. So that's something in my journey. Obviously 2002, 2003, it's 20 years ago, and my thinking, has developed and been embellished. And I think what's been particularly helpful for me has been having the opportunity as a theological educator to actually do increasing amounts of research into the biblical text and interpretations of the biblical text. So questions or answers? I think before we seek answers from a text like Genesis, it really is important to ask some questions. When I was a teen in youth group in church, we used to sing a song, Jesus is the answer for the world today. Someone might know that song. I don't ever remember us pausing and wondering, what's the question that's been answered by Jesus? We didn't sort of think about that too much. And I think sometimes people can approach the Bible as well. The Bible is the answer to everything. We're not just pausing, thinking, what's the question? What are the questions here that need to be answered first? So some see it as an answer book. I don't happen to see it that way particularly, although it does have some answers and some forms of answers within it. But tonight I want to explore some of the questions that we might have in the text. I'm not going to be discussing the fine details of Genesis 1 and 2. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want to. I'll touch on a few bits and pieces to go through. But I want to think about some of the broader foundational questions, how we approach the biblical text. So here are my 4 questions. I'm going to work through each of them in turn. What form did Genesis take before it was literature, before it was written? What kind of literature is Genesis? Who might Genesis target audience or audiences of that? And what purpose or purposes could Genesis have served these readers? And as we explore those questions, it might help us to think about, help you to think how you consider that modern world, from a modern world perspective, how that fits or doesn't with an ancient world perspective. So we'll take each of those in turn. In case you're wondering about graphic one, that's from the Aboriginal Theological College in the Morling Territory. And it's a modern piece of art which was created to sort of the creation story. It's a beautiful piece. So, before Genesis was literature. The first question may have struck you as a bit odd. Before Genesis was literature. I've been amazed over the years that when I've said to people, you do realise that what we have in Genesis wasn't originally written down. They go, oh. Why is that? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. I hadn't thought about that before. We didn't need to think about it before it was literature. What was it before it was literature? Well, storytelling, songs, all sorts of ways of conveying sometimes literature. People like Tom Driver, for example, have done a lot of research and writing on how ancient cultures express their stories in a pre-literary kind of context. But they were recounting events. They were talking about things that happened. They were, in broad senses, talking about what they believed and sometimes why they believed. I think stories were told for specific purposes. They don't seem to be lacking intention. We don't always know the intention, what the intention was, but there seemed to be an intentionality behind it. In biblical studies, one of the things that we sometimes talk about is authorial intention. What did the author of the story intend? And I always say, It's a really fraught question. It's how would you really know? Unless I had the author here and I said, what did you intend? But even then, sometimes authors don't know what they intend by their writing. There's always a surplus of meaning, as Paul records. We don't always know from an authorial point of view. But stories seem to be told for specific reasons. And I would suggest that the major reason they were told was to make sense out of the world, and to make meaning out of the world. Like I suggested before, to express matters of belief, ways of understanding and seeing the world. Regis Professor Graham Ward wrote a book a number of years ago called Unbelievable, where he talks about the evolution of belief and at what points can we identify that people actually believed anything or something. And often it comes through in the stories that were told. The stories represent the beliefs that people have. And he recounts many pre-literary examples. For example, where they've excavated a cave, which is a burial cave. And rather than the bones of humans simply being scattered, they're actually arranged in a certain pattern, which indicates belief. They believe something, and so they arrange them in that way for a particular reason, based on a particular belief. Specific stories become meaningful over time. They're not always meaningful to begin with. And I think it's really interesting as you read through the Bible and see some of those stories. They weren't necessarily meaningful at the time, but they become increasingly meaningful over a period of time. They may have been meaningful to an individual, then they become meaningful to families, to clans, to tribes, and ultimately to whole people groups. If you like, the story of the Israelites is one of those stories. Trace it back, it was meaningful to Abraham and Sarah as individuals, then it became meaningful to their descendants, and then it became meaningful to a whole group of people. These stories represented memories, collective memories, cultural memories of people through generations. And they were all, in my view, attempts to make sense of them, to make meaning out of them. As you go through the biblical text, you often find examples of this. I often refer to them as theological commentary, which is where an event takes place and the story is told, and the writer actually goes beyond just telling what happened and actually gives an interpretation of what happened or why it happened. I'll talk a little bit about that later on too. So my second question, what kind of literature, once it did become literature, what kind of literature is Genesis? And really here I'm talking about creation accounts. We don't have time to talk about the whole of Genesis. There's too much there. One of the things that we've discovered in the last 150 to 200 years through archaeology is that there are lots and lots of other creation accounts in the ancient world. And there are many similarities between the other accounts, and there are some significant differences between those accounts and accounts that we have in the biblical text. But what it tells us is that all ancient cultures that we're aware of had some desire, some need perhaps, to tell a story about how things began. Now, that's probably not surprising. The seeking of origin. One of my hunches is that one of the reasons why people are very interested in discovering they found a tree, people have always been interested in that, but seems to be an increase in interest today, is because it's our sense of identity. Where do we come from? Who do we belong to? What part of the world is the world's kinds of questions. Probably the best known creation account outside of the biblical text is the Babylonian account, the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish is a very interesting account because if you can read it in English translations, Google it, if you've never looked at it, just Google Enuma Elish in English, you'll find it has a number of similarities with Genesis, the first creation account in particular. One of the most fascinating things is that it's often referred to as the 7 tablets of creation because it's literally written in 7 tablets. And of course, you know the significance of number 7 in that first creation account. The second creation account, and you'll notice I'm referring to them as first and second creation account, not Genesis 1 and 2, so about that later on. But the second creation account is quite different. as I'm sure you're aware, it's told differently. It's a different kind of story. And it has some different features and some paradoxical or even contradictory features when you compare the two stories together. And what's interesting to me is that no one's made an attempt to harmonise the two stories. I mean, those stories, whenever you date those stories have been around a long, long time. In written, and of course before that in oral. But no one seems to have made an attempt to actually harmonise them. And I'll talk more about that as we go through that as well. So what we now know, which we didn't know before, is that the literary style that we have here in Genesis is typical of the ancient Near Eastern context. It certainly has unique content, no question about that. The form, the way the story is told, the way the story is shaped, shouldn't surprise us. It was a product of its time. And I guess this is one of the things, and obviously I'm not familiar with pretty much anything about this, maybe a few a little bit more than others, but it's one of the things that sometimes people don't realise, that this comes out of an ancient world context, and it reflects that context, and we've now got evidence of what that context, that broader context, actually looked. We don't just need to say, well, the Bible was like stuff in the ancient Near Eastern world. We've got stuff we can compare it to and look at it alongside one another. So who might Genesis take audience to be? Well, this is the tricky one as well, but one thing we can say in Genesis is that Genesis was written by ancient peoples for ancient peoples. Now again, you might say to me, well, isn't that obvious? Well, I would have thought so, but it's interesting to me that a lot of people don't seem to actually think about it. When you say it, they go, oh, yes, that's true, but they don't necessarily acknowledge that or appreciate that to begin with. So when we recognise that Genesis was written by ancient peoples for ancient peoples, it raises a question. Do we read it the same way? Can we read it the same way as modern 21st century Western people reading through those eyes? I remember having a student in class a number of years ago who asked the question, how close can a person like me get to reading the Bible like a person of the ancient Near East? And I said, probably not very close. I think with an approach, we can get close. That's part of the purpose of the function of theological education, to help people get closer to that perspective. But it's a given that we just need to recognise that we do not walk in the shoes of ancient Near Eastern people. Ancient audiences, by virtue of that, held different views of the cosmos to modern people. And so the writers of Genesis were writing out of the context where they believed certain things about how the cosmos was formed and functioned, how it looked like, what it looked like. And they may be different to how we do as modern people. Here are some examples. In the ancient world, everything is spiritual. In the modern world, we tend to distinguish between, things that are animate, things that are inanimate. We distinguish between, well, this is a spiritual thing, this is not a spiritual thing. In the ancient world, everything was viewed as spiritual. So, for example, I'm using the Testament, Paul in Corinthians can talk about the rock that followed them around in the desert. Now, as a modern reader, I would say, well, it's a metaphor. He doesn't really mean that a rock followed them around in the desert. Well, I don't know about that. He was probably using it metaphorically, but something suggests to me that there was also a sense that he believed that rocks and things in the natural were actually spiritual things. That God was present in creation. The second example is that the gods caused everything that happens, good and bad. So in Numbers, for example, Numbers 11, the fire goes through the camp. They don't just say, well, it was really hot day today, it's really windy, so we had a bad fire. The writer says God sent the fire through the camp. Now, whether God sent the fire through the camp or not, it shows us the ancient Near Eastern mindset and world. That when these things take place, they automatically believe that God or the gods have caused this to happen. I guess as a follow-on, and if it's a bad thing, fire or earthquake or a child dies, then the corollary of that is, well, we must have done something. We've upset God, so God is punishing us. Conversely, if we get a good crop, or we have lots of children, or someone recovers from sickness, well, we must have done something good, and so God is pleased with us. Now again, we may have a different view to that today, but in the ancient world that seemed to be the way that people thought. And I'm not just talking here about Israelites, the people of Hebrew faith, or Israelite faith, but just generally in the ancient Near Eastern world. The world is vertical. There's the underworld, like the Greek underworld. There's the life on earth, and then there's the heavens, where the gods live. And it's very interesting because in the biblical text, those three realms are very clearly delineated, and there are often problems when those boundaries are traversed. Typically, in the ancient Near East, the only time the gods really traversed the line and came down as the earthly realm was when they were upset. The humans were causing problems, so they came down and sorted out. And of course, there are crossings down to the underworld as well. But it was this very tiered world, and it was a vertical world. It was a flat earth with all those sort of images we all have in the Bible. So just before I go on to that, so those, that's just an example, just a sample of some of the worldview understandings that ancient people had. And so when we come to a book like Genesis, when we read accounts like the creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2, we need to recognise that the people writing these had a very particular view of the world. And we today would have a different view in a number of respects to the kind of views that they have. The last picture, which is a very interesting one, is the doubling of stories. And this is a classic example we have at the beginning of Genesis, because like I said, we have two creation stories, quite different, and yet they've never been harmonised. I have a Jewish background, you want to notice that? Cohen. And I think maybe it's because of my Jewish background, I'm not sure, but maybe my connections with Judaism as well. But one reason I've noticed the differences between Jewish tradition and Christian tradition is that Jewish tradition thrives on disagreement. If you've ever seen rabbis discussing Torah, it's a pretty feisty discussion. It's kind of no holds barred. They'll go their best of friends, but they will argue vehemently for their perspective. But they'll also respect the other person who argue vehemently for their different perspective. They can actually manage paradox and contradiction quite well. I think in the Christian tradition, at least the Christian traditions I have been involved in, contradiction and paradox is not handled too well. There seems to be it's like a pointy end of faith. You have to kind of come to a conclusion. So this is what it means. Judaism, on the other hand, is quite different, where it's like, let's look at the diversity of meanings, and let's actually be happy that there's a diversity of meanings. So you may never have done it. If you've ever read a commentary that's a Jewish commentary on the Bible, you'll find it so different to commentaries that are written in the Western world, or commentaries that are written from a Eurocentric perspective. Because a Jewish commentary does something like this. Rabbi Cohen said this. Rabbi Shmei said this. Rabbi so-and-so said this, and Rabbi such and such said that. Really different views. And that's really believable. And as the reader, you kind of go away thinking, okay, so I've got, what does that mean? Try and figure out myself. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's always that way, but that's the general kind of character of that kind of discussion. So what I'm moving to is this idea of, I've got a colleague in Melbourne who's done a lot of research on this, and what he's been looking at is the doublings that happen in the Hebrew scriptures, because that's what he's particularly interested in. So where stories are doubled, or where characters are doubled, where there's kind of doppelgangers, that kind of thing. And it's amazing what he's turned. There are so many of these doublings, and sometimes even triplets, where things are stories told 3 times, where things happen on 3 different occasions. Christopher Hodgkin wrote a book just a couple of years ago, looking at the Bible as a literary text. So he wasn't really looking at it theologically, or from a biblical scholarship perspective, it was just a literature. And one of the comments that he made I use the term depth of field. He uses the image of binoculars or glasses, spectacles, and he says that one of the purposes of doubling stories is to give us dimension, or as I put it, depth of field. So if you hear one story, you can very easily get a very flat picture of what's going on, the story that's being told. But when you get a second story, which differs, that's the key point. When you get a story that differs, then that brings a richness, which is like having a second lens, having binoculars, two lenses rather than one. You get a depth of field that you may not otherwise have had. We see a similar thing in the New Testament with the Gospels. What are the actual Gospels? And why are they quite different? Why are they even contradictory? So one of my favourite stories is Blind Bartimaeus. And a lot of them left that story thinking, so was Jesus entering Jericho, walking through Jericho, or exiting Jericho? Well, it depends which gospel you read. Did Jesus call Bartimaeus over, or did the disciples, or did Bartimaeus? Well, it depends which gospel you read. So again, it's an example of this depth of field. It's the difference that causes us, I think, or to cause us to ask some questions. So I think that's what happens with the creation stories. We've got two accounts. It should at least cause us to say why they're different. Not just what's different, why are they different. So ancient Near Eastern audiences seem to be comfortable with paradox and even contradiction. And that's something that, and again, I'm speaking from my context, which is all I've experienced, but from my context, that's something that I found people find quite difficult, quite challenging to actually manage. In fact, there are some Christian circles that you've been where if you use the word contradiction, it's almost like you sort of can't use contradiction in the same sentence. But if they're not contradictions, well, I don't know what you call them. So they look like that to them. So what's the purpose or the purposes of Genesis in particular? Well, I want to suggest a couple of possibilities because we don't really know. That's the problem. We don't have the authors here. We don't have the people who told the stories originally to give us their answers. But here's a couple of suggestions. These stories could be ideological. So what I mean by that is they're written at a later time in history, looking back and asking a question like, well, this is our situation in life now. This is how we experience life. How did we get here? What might have happened? What might have transpired in order for us to be like we are today? And I think there's a fairly good argument to suggest that creation stories are ideological, written in a later time, particularly the first account. I was saying before, it's very similar in many respects to the Babylonian Nineveh Elish. And I would go as far as to say, if you asked the author, the writer of Genesis 1, the first creation account, if you asked them, what were you reading when you wrote the first creation account? I'm not sure the answer would be the Babylonian Nineveh Elish. A lot of scholars would argue, and I'm on this side from this perspective, that Genesis, the first creation account, is a polemic against the Babylonian Nineveh. So if that's so, then it's a much later account. So it's a select account of creation. So ideological, it's looking back and it's saying this is where we are now as the people of Israel, and this explains where we came from. This is our origins. The second account, a little bit different, could be ideological. I mean, there are ideological elements in it. For example, at the end of chapter 2, where it talks about two becoming flesh, it's like an image of marriage. That's probably a later period looking back. So we now have marriage in society. How do we tie that to the idea of origins and creation? Well, we can tie it to this idea of the man being made, formed, the woman being constructed, it's the language used in the Hebrew, and then brought together as one flesh. So it could be seen as ideological in that sense as well. But it could be teleological. That's the other way around. So that's looking forward. So project a story that evolves over time. So life is lived, it unfolds, and the story is written, and sense is made of the world as time goes on. I actually think it's probably a combination of both. When we look at Genesis 1 and 2 together, I think there are ideological elements looking back. I think there are teleological elements looking forward. I want to be a bit cautious with the word teleological, because that word can be interpreted in the sense that everything has a particular goal or a particular aim. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just talking about it in terms of process rather than in terms of results. So I'm not suggesting that if we view the creation stories as teleological, that it was painting a picture of some particular thing that had to be to become not that specific. But overall, I think these stories are about meaning. And in fact, I wouldn't even limit that to the creation stories of Genesis. I think if you look at the creation stories across the ancient Near Eastern world, they are all attempts at meaning making. They are all attempts to make sense of who we are as a people, whether we're Babylonians, or Hittites, or Egyptians, or Israelites. So what about the how, particularly the how of creation? When I was a kid, 1974, I must admit, I just wanted to know, how did God do this? What were the mechanics involved? What was the process involved? Well, if you ask me this question, would an ancient person hearing or reading Genesis, would they have really thought that God did it literally, concretely, the way it's described in Genesis? My answer would be, yeah, they probably did. They probably did believe it. We do know that the Hebrew world, the Israelite world, Hebrew language itself is a very concrete language. So it makes sense that creation stories are expressed in very concrete ways. So it's reasonable, I think, to imagine they probably thought, but they also probably thought things like God had hands, and God was a bigger form of a human. Here I am here, God's like me, just a lot bigger. So God, when God's angry, is like a human who's angry, but just a lot more. Or God, when God is gracious or compassionate, is like our grace and compassion, but just a lot more. So that was a common understanding. Francesca Capullo has written a book called Embodiment of God, and it's a really fascinating read because she talks about how we can see in the Hebrew Bible very clear evidence that the ancient Hebrew people believed this concept of God, that God was just a bigger kind of human. God, yes, but bigger human, bigger face, bigger arms, bigger legs, all that kind of thing. Very, almost a corporeal kind of vision of God. Having said that, when it comes to the question of how, I don't think that ancient audiences were that concerned about the how. They probably thought that God did it that way, but I don't really think that was a significant part of the discussion. Why do I say that? Because from what we understand of stories, they're about making sense of life. And making sense of life in part has to do with how things happen, but more importantly, making sense of life is about why things happen. And I think when you look more deeply at Genesis, the transcendent issue in Genesis creation stories is why things happen in the first place. What does it tell us about God? What does it tell us about humankind and creation? And what does it tell us about the relationship between those two? So let's look at the passages in a little bit of detail, not much detail because of time. Genesis 1 to 2, 4, 8. So what was their context of writing? Well, I've already suggested that Genesis, the first creation account, Genesis 1 to 2, 4, was probably Zilk. So it's probably not an early account. It was a bit confusing. It's like, well, it's the first account. Wouldn't it be the earliest? Well, that's what we tend to assume, but why do we assume that? It's like, why do we assume that Psalm 1 is the first psalm? It probably wasn't. It just been assembled over time. I can go into reasons why we know that, but you just take my word for it if that's okay at this point. But the context of the writing is important. And as I suggested, the first account was written in exile, then it was a polemic. It was the Israelites in exile making sense of their story alongside other people who had their own story. What did they want to say about creation. This is where I think it gets really important to me. They wanted to say that God, the God that they believed in, was the initiator of what I would describe as the Aleph. So the Hebrew alphabet, first letter is Aleph, the last letter is Tav. So it's like the A to Z. So the rabbis say, in the first verse, when we read in Hebrew, there's a little particle called the direct object particle. So we call it the name. It's made up of two Hebrew letters, Aleph and Tav. And the rabbis say two things about Genesis 1:1. The first thing they say is that the first letter in the Hebrew Bible is a bet. It's like the letter B. It's the second letter in the Hebrew Bible. And the reason why the Bible begins with the letter B is because God, the Creator, pre-existed creation. So it couldn't begin with an Aleph, the A. And then the other thing they say is this Aleph Tav, this combination. The idea that God created Et, that's the Aleph Tav together, Et Hashemayim, the Et Aleph. So the Aleph Tav of Hashemayim, the heavens, and the Aleph Tav of the earth. So God created from the beginning to the end, the whole thing. In our language, we might say God created everything A to Z, including God. But God was the initiator. God in relationship with creation. God, deistic God, not clockwork, clockmaker God, who wants the universe up, deistic, beautiful. But God who's intimate and involved in creation. I'll say a bit more about that. Chaos being brought into order. That's the constant theme that flows from the very beginning. We have that image of talking of a bottle, which is almost impossible to translate, but it's emptiness, it's void, it's disorder, it's chaos, and this idea of moving chaos to order. But the impetus for movement is God's self. So God is the initiator of creation, and part of that creation, a big part of that creation, is the movement, the impetus of chaos to order. Division along functional divisions. If we went through that first creation, there's a lot of division, dividing between waters, dividing between all sorts of different entities in creation. Was creation good or perfect? I grew up being told creation was perfect. Then I started to read the Bible in English, and I realised that it says creation is good, so I started thinking, what does that mean? And it actually says a lot of things in creation good, and when it gets to humans, it says humans are very good. When in Hebrew it says they're tall, and when it gets to humans, they're tall or they're very good in Hebrew. They just put that very after the good. It's the same thing. And what does tall mean? Well, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just means that things function in the way that they're intended to function. I think N.T. Wright puts it this way. He says they were fit for purpose. It doesn't mean they were necessarily, but maybe it was. I don't know. That's not what in Hebrew is But that says something about the Hebrew world. This is a world that functions well, necessarily perfect. Position and the function of humankind, the imperative, to be fruitful, not to replenish the earth, to have dominion over the earth. And we talk a lot about the terminology used there. It's very graphic terminology. But it's a divine imperative for humankind. It places humankind in the community of creation to have a particular role. It gives them a form of authority, but I don't believe preeminence. We are a part of the creation, we're part of the community of creation. Some of those roles then, so the division of functional along functional lines and bringing chaos into order, in ancient Israelite society, they were functions of the priesthood. So one of the major roles of the priests was to determine what's clean and what's unclean, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. We read all about that in Leviticus. It was also the idea of bringing chaos into order, so making things that were unclean clean. And there was a ritual involved for those kinds of processes. So that's led some to say that this first creation account was quite possibly written in the exile, was quite possibly authored by the priestly group in Israel. It was only the major concerns. They wanted to order things and they wanted to check that everything had correct function. Now that's all speculation. I think there's a reasonable basis for suggesting that in the case. The Sabbath is culmination. This is where the chapter division in our English Bibles is so unfortunate. It's just in the wrong place because it actually separates the Sabbath from the rest of the creation. When we separate where it ought to be separated, and if you want to know why it ought to be separated there or not, where it is in our English Bibles, I can talk about that. That's another discussion. But the point is that when we include the Sabbath in creation, it actually makes the culmination of creation about God's self rather than about humans who are created for the sixth day. So John Walton, who's a recent prolific writer in Genesis, has suggested that what we see here in the first creation is an image of the earth creation as the temple. And the culmination of creation is God coming and dwelling in the earthly temple on the seventh day. Now you can see echoes of that in the tabernacle in Exodus, and then in the temple when Solomon built the temple ultimately. God's presence among God's people, in the midst of God's people. Now, if all was right, then the creation account, that first creation account, is really not concerned about the how mechanics of creation. It's actually more concerned with telling us something theological. That creation is about God dwelling with humans, God dwelling within the community of creation. Now, for those of us who are Christians, we might say, well, that's not it. Like, we know that God exists in our world. But remember, we're talking about an ancient text written by ancient people. And an ancient text written by ancient people, the default setting was, where are the gods? Gods are up in the heavens and realms. Where are humans? They're in the earth humans. So, this first creation account directly challenges that kind of worldview and says this is not the way it is, maybe the way we think it is. So it's actually quite remarkable, actually, that a text like this could be written, a story told in this particular way. So why are they saying these things about creation? Well, I think, without wanting to be too simplistic, but I think they were saying these things about creation because they were wanting to make sense of something that said before, and it was, who is this God that we trust? How does this God relate to us? How do we relate to this God? And what does it mean to be human in the community? So we're trying to answer all of those questions, and this was one part of that answer. Let me go to the second. Just a few things here. So this is the birthing of a new story. In chapter 2, verse 4b, there's an interesting word used in the Hebrew. I'll put it there on the screen. Toledot comes from the Hebrew verb yalad, which means to give birth. So if a mother gives birth to a child, she yalads a child. It's an easy one to remember. It's just to give yalad. So toledot comes from that word. This is a key word in Genesis because many times at very critical points, the critical junctions in introducing a new story. And so what's happening here is that between these two creation accounts, this is saying we've had a creation story, now this is the birthing of a new creation story. It's the same, but it's different. It's different, but it's the same. The similarities and contrasts. One of those contrasts is that in the first creation story, God is Elohim. Now, Elohim is a very common word for God in the ancient book. El is a generic word for God. It's like an animal. If you say God, who is God? Well, it depends who you ask. There are different views because God is a very generic term. And so, in the first chapter, Genesis, in the first account, God is Elohim. And that makes sense because if it is a polemic against the Enmalish, the Babylonians were one of the people who believed that El, this generic God, sat at the top of the pantheon of all gods. So it makes sense that we're going to have creation story. We talk about that God at the top. This wasn't some subsidiary God who created this, was the very top. But in the second account, this God becomes Yahweh. Yahweh is the divine name. This is the name given to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. Rather poorly translated as I am who I am. Some other discussion at some time as well. But the divine name in Exodus 3, that's what's attached. So the second account is telling us that, okay, God created, but the God created is actually Yahweh. The God of the Israelites. The function of the Adam, the human. At the very beginning of the second creation account, we just have the Adam. It's the human. And it's the first time in the creation accounts where it says something is not good. It's not good that the human is alone. And so, the stories about it. So God puts the human to sleep. God takes the side of the human, not the release, and takes the side of the human and literally builds. That's the word wisdom here, but he used to build it to construct. So God constructs the woman. There's some really interesting language used in these chapters about how things actually happen. And then, of course, the story brings the woman to the man. And it's interesting because when that happens, the man recognises sameness and difference. Again, the way it's expressed in the Hebrew, he sees the woman, he calls her the Ezer Kenegdo, which is a bit hard to translate in, but it means something like this entity was like me, but not like me. There's a similarity, there's a difference. But the two, embedded in those terms is this idea that they ought to be together. There's a rightness of that and being together. So that's just a sample. But you can see straight away that the second account is telling us some different things about creation and about the purpose of creation. You could argue it's telling us about the mechanics, how it happened, but again, I can argue that much more important, it's trying to tell us something about why this is the way it is. So I want to finish with this. How might we read Genesis here? Well, generally speaking, as I said, we need to read it as literature on two peoples and just acknowledge the fact that we can't read it through those lenses. It's a very difficult thing. Making sense of the world ideologically and teleologically. I think the lovely thing that's happening probably really only in the last few decades is that we're seeing Indigenous peoples from around the world starting to research and write on the creation stories. And we're getting incredible insights because many Indigenous peoples actually get what's happening in the text. So our Aboriginal people here in Australia, in the United Church, I know in the Anglican Church, and Catholic Church, there's been quite a bit of work done by Aboriginal theologians reading creation stories among them through Indigenous eyes. That picture I showed you earlier was an artistic example of that kind of interpretation. But it's been very, very helpful for people like me, a white male who lives in the 21st century Western context and grew up in that context. So hearing how others interpret the story, particularly Indigenous peoples, I think is very important. So we've got people in the majority of the world who are writing as literature emerged from a particular historical context that needs to be read through that lens. We can't, we ought not simply say, if that's the way I understand it, that's the way I understand it. I think there's a false equivalency. We're not paying due respect to them, their context and their worldview, and we're projecting, we're extrapolating, we're interpolating to that our own worldview. We can read it as literature that at its heart is trying to make sense of God, creation, and the relationship between them. That's the theological perspective, I think, on the text. Specifically, creation stories that espouse critical principles about how creation is intended to function well. And this is where it becomes really important for us today. Because if we see the creation stories as a model of God's ideal, and having lots of different elements to that ideal, then it makes us ask questions about our world today. And we say, That's how God created the world. This is the world we live in. Is there a difference? What are the differences? Things that as a description of how God comes to dwell within creation amongst people. Like I said, for those of us who are Christians, and that may not be something that's difficult for us to grasp, God dwelling with us. But I know for me, the people that I'm involved with who are not people of faith come to that realisation is a big step. To actually appreciate the fact that God may be among us. We are, Emmanuel. To read it as defining paradigms for how community, how a Trinity creation is intended to function. So not just seeing it as an ideal, but looking at how it works and seeing. So just as one example, I don't know if you've ever thought about this question, but if you think about Genesis, the first creation account, just think about it as the Garden of Eden, as a literal place for a moment. Okay? What was that sign of the Garden of Eden? Is it the same outside the Garden of Eden as what the Garden of Eden is described as? If it was the same, why does God say, subdue it and have dominion over it? Why would you need to do that if the world outside the garden is the same as the world inside the garden, which seems to be a kind of utopian place where everything functions well? It's not say perfectly, but it functions well. So it becomes paradigmatic in the sense that if we think, okay, so part of the imperative of humans is to eventually move outside of the garden and to bring Eden, the Eden here, to the rest of creation, then what does that mean for us today? So that's just one. I can start on that. That's just one question that I think arises out of this creation account. Okay, creation through time. Just 4 quotes that I'm giving you. People who've said something that I think is very popular. Thomas Aquinas, sake of Scripture, wishes simply to declare that the world was made by God. All the philosophers have said as much. But to say how it was made, this is a subject of dispute. And rash are those who wade into it without the help of faith. So it wasn't again the idea of talking about how it happened, but we say really carefully. John Wesley, the world with everything in it is the creation of God. How or when it can is beyond the reach of our knowledge, and it does not concern us to know. And what is it? It's Wesley. Creation today, a couple of more recent writers. Gerhard von Rach, who was a prominent 20th century theologian, particularly in North Eastern Europe. 7 days are a theological structure designed to emphasise the Sabbath as the climax of creation, as we were saying before. It serves as a didactic purpose for training the cosmos in the divine order structure rather than a detailed chronological sequence. As you can probably tell, I don't mind Gerhard von Rach's understanding. The days of Genesis, John Sartman was a contemporary theologian, biblical scholar. The days of Genesis 1, he's talking about that first account particularly, are not 7 consecutive days of creation, but rather a literary framework that describes God's creative acts. The purpose is to highlight the theological significance of creation rather than a chronological account. Now, I'll go through points there with people who say, you need to read them as 7 literal days and that kind of thing as well. But the reason I'm not doing that is because I actually think that's misleading. I think what's being said here is actually getting to the core of what these creation skills are. It's about why did God do it. It's not so concerned about how God did it, but it's describing how as an avenue towards understanding. So there are a few thoughts, and I'm happy to go through some questions and comments. If you disagree with something I said, that's perfectly fine as well. So, yep.
Can you just expand what you mean by said that the creation accounts for electric gas?
So last bit again, sorry.
Can you just expand what you meant when you said that the creation accounts were polemic against what was written in the Babylonian account?
Oh, yes, yeah. So the way it's thought about is that when they went into exile, when the people of Israel went into exile, which is 587 BC, they encountered a very sophisticated religion in the Babylonian religion, and the Babylonian Enema Elish dates to about 2000 BCE, so it's a very well-established creation story by the time people go into exile. So the thinking is that they encountered Babylonian religion, they encountered Marduk, the god of the Babylonians, amongst others, and the creation account, and it caused them to reformulate their telling of the creation story. So the second account was they probably had the second account by the time they went into exile, and they reformulated to reflect like the 7 days, possibly reflects the 7 tablets of the Babylonian Enema Elish.
I guess because you're basically that's saying to me that when they wrote the creation accounts down, despite having 2,000 years of history, they were influenced by the Babylonian accounts.
In terms of form, yes, yeah, but not only in terms of form, because I mean it's difficult without having the 2 accounts in front of us, so we can compare the 2. But there are some very specific differences. So, for example, the Babylonian account, humans are created to do the things that the gods were involved to do. Whereas in the Genesis account, in the first creation account, humans are they're created in the image and likeness of God. So that's a significant difference. They are given work to do, but it's not work for the gods, it's actually work for themselves, it's work for creation. So there are a number of significant points of difference between the 2. So what I'm saying is that the creation story existed, but it became a different kind of narrative in the exile. I mean, that's only one view. That's not necessarily the correct view. That's one view. That's helpful.
Yeah, but I guess that's where you're saying that a lot of the stories in the Bible have some cultures. So therefore, they got on with that culture. They got on with that culture.
Oh yeah, for sure. And there are those who would say that the first creation account is simply borrowing of the Enema Elish and adapting for the Israelite context. The answer to that really comes down to a matter of belief. I mean, we don't have the evidence to argue one way or the other. I mean, what we do know is, as I said, the Enema Elish comes from the 2nd millennium BCE. We don't know the timing of the biblical accounts of creation because we don't have the material evidence. So the earliest written accounts we have of creation, Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, or maybe Septuagint, if you like, but you're looking at, say, 3rd century BC. So that's a lot later than Babylonian Enema Elish. So there are certain guys who say, well, the Israelites just write their stories from the Babylonians. I don't hold to that view. I think the stories, like I said, they had these stories of literature. And that's an interesting example of how they responded to the culture around them. Here are people telling the story in a very systematic way, and so they systematized their story in a similar way. But they told a different story, so their story was unique. I'm not sure if that.
Yeah. So basically, they the culture and not otherwise. I would say the young people influence them comfortably in Babylonian culture, so they kind of wrote it down as a counter.
Yeah.
And to also codify their culture, their cultural knowledge.
Exactly, yeah. Because one of the things that I often find myself talking about is that so when they went into exile, they effectively lost everything that defined their identity as a people. So they lost king, land, temple. The only thing they had left was their story, narrative, which was the Exodus story, and they had the concept of covenant relationship with that's pretty much what they had. They had law, but they couldn't practice law because they were in Babylon. So one of the ways that they countered that certainly was that they retold their story. Another example of that, moving right away from creation, is First and Second. So First and Second Chronicles is a retelling of their pre-exilic history in an exilic or post-exilic context. So there's that double thing, retelling the story for a new time, for a new context, with a new understanding. And it seems to be a very common practice. I mean, there's an argument to say that Ezra and Nehemiah is like the new Torah. It's like it's a retelling of Genesis to Deuteronomy in very abbreviated form. But Ezra effectively reinstituted the Torah for post-exilic.
Yes.
Chronicles retells the history as Samuel was told the history before them. So,
I guess the doubling is in two you call it
yeah. Yes, of course.
You said the seventh day was the climax of the creation. We read that God rested on the seventh day. He blessed it and made it holy. So that was the vision or the dream of the Creator. The whole universe and with human beings and God living in one existence, in holy relationship. And we find that the covenant, the goal of the covenant and the sign of the covenant, both was to keep the Sabbath holy. And then Jesus, when Jesus said, I came to give you rest. Those are the really time. Come to me, I will give you rest. The holy rest, the Sabbath rest, is given by only Jesus. So I feel that concept of rest didn't come anywhere in the creation explanation.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's we say Sabbath and rest. I think that needs to be nuanced because the word Shabbat in Hebrew actually means to stop. And what it means to do more beyond that, it means to stop what you regularly do. It doesn't mean to stop everything. So in the case of God, it's very interesting because the way God's creating work is described, it uses a particular Hebrew word, sort of noun, which indicates that it's God's vocation. So in the creation accounts, if God has a job, God's job is to create things. And so when Shabbat comes, Sabbath, the seventh day, God rests from what God regularly does. Now at that point in time, God was regularly creating, so God rests from creating. I grew up in a context which said Sabbath is about stopping everything. Well, I'm going to worship, but stop everything. That's actually not the biblical concept of Shabbat. It's the stopping of regular activity. So, in other words, if you're a plumber, for you to have a Shabbat as a plumber is to stop plumbing. It doesn't necessarily mean you stop doing a whole lot of other things, but you stop plumbing. But the point you made before, the idea of God dwelling in creation and being, and that being the culmination is absolutely critical. And I think, like I said, unfortunately with our Bibles, with the division between chapters 1 and 2, it kind of excises the Sabbath off and story, and we treat it as something separate. Because it's reinforced in Deuteronomy, well, in Exodus 20, but then in Deuteronomy as well, keeping, observing the Sabbath, because it becomes a sin, and also in the post-exilic community with Ezra and Nehemiah, it becomes a sign of the community of God. I'll go first.
I'd just like to add to that. Is it possible that imagery of God coming in and the Sabbath and having Sabbath and rest and people stopping to parallel it to us, our bodies becoming temple of God, and when the Holy Spirit comes in, we stop doing things in human efforts, and then we his yoke is easy and his burden is light, and we start doing things by the power and in the power of the Holy Spirit, and we never go back to doing things in our own strength, so that Sabbath is a more like a lifestyle of rest, working, engaging, working with him from that perspective.
Maybe. I mean, it's interesting because when the New Testament talks about us being temple of the Spirit, it's actually spoken to the church, not the individual. So we're the community of God, are the temple of the Holy Spirit. So I guess what I want to say, I don't disagree with where you went with that, but I guess my starting point would be to say, and this links to what he was on, I think. So God dwells in the community of creation. A little later in Exodus, Deuteronomy, God dwells in the community of Israel, which is a microcosm. It's intended to be a microcosm of the ideal of creation. So Israel is meant to mirror the Edenic utopia and then take that to the rest of the world. The church in the New Testament has that same kind of position and mission, that we are to mirror the, if you like, if that's good terminology, but the Edenic utopia of Genesis 1 and 2. The church is meant to mirror that, be the dwelling place of God, and then be able to take that to the world. So in Israel's case, the idea was that Israel expands as the community of God, and God's presence expands. So ultimately all the nations of the earth are designed, as the Psalms talk about. For the church, it's no different. That the church expands and God's presence is within the church, but the rest of the world experience that.
And is that the parallel we're talking about Eden?
Yeah.
So that's the kingdom of God expanding.
Well, it's interesting to use the language kingdom because those words in Genesis 1, so have dominion over, and that's royal kind of language. Like that's the language of kings. It's the language of use this word, but it's the language of the empire. It's the language, but it's God's in. God's a king, not a human. So yeah, it's about not taking control of it, but it's actually about acknowledging God's control of it in the God. I don't know the control, God's authority. And so, in that sense, it's no different for what we see in creation accounts, what we see in Israel as the community of faith and for the church. So there's a lot of parallels there.
Okay, so there's a lot of essential theology in the creation stories. This question is a simple one. How did that get there? Most of us believe in divine inspiration. What's the process to? It's very interesting how you've told us, the human context and how we got to have this written account. What's the process of God putting in his divine inspiration?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on your view of inspiration, I guess. But I think so. I have a couple of comments on that, and take this for its worth. I'm thinking around this, so I'm just responding in a sense off the top of my head, but also I guess my own perspectives. So one thing I would say is that I think when we read the text, one of the things we're doing is we're reading a text of people through a long history were doing theology. So they're doing theology, and one of the ways they're doing theology, like I said, is telling stories and ultimately writing those stories down. But then we now know that those stories were often edited, and sometimes they were formulated in certain ways in responses to their cultural and historical context. So all those dynamics were happening. I would say that God was a part of that process, and if you ask me why I would say that, and what basis I would have for that, the answer I would give is because some of the things that we read in the biblical text, my knowledge of the ancient Near Eastern context would suggest that they're so countercultural that it would be hard to explain it in another way. So I mean, let's give a very, very obvious example. Monotheism, and we take it for granted. even when I talk to my friends who are not people of faith, but most of them believe there's a God, if I say to them, do you think there's more than one God? They say, no. I mean, I'm talking in Western context. But in an ancient Near Eastern context, that's like me standing here tonight saying to you, I know all your life you've heard that there's only one God, but I want to tell you that's wrong. There's actually lots of gods. And it's like that kind of difference. So that says to me that there's something else going on. This kind of thinking, I think, would be very difficult to just emerge from personal and community's thinking. I think, because I'll just be honest with you and say that I believe in a God who has always, in different ways, acted and intervened in the world. I believe in interventionist God. I want to put conditions on that. Don't necessarily mean, intervenes in any way, but intervenes in certain ways. So, but if you ask me, how do we understand inspiration? And that's a really hard.
I guess on this unless God spoke to somebody and said, write this down, then it seems more logical that anybody writing down a creation story, from their point of view, they couldn't have conceived of a time span stretching millions and millions of years. Just like when we read the Bible, we tend to think it was written to us, and we have to stop and think, we're not the intended audience for this, so it's good for us.
Yeah.
I can have conceived of time spans like that. They would have thought it was done relatively recently, and therefore it had to be done, stuff like that. So,
there was no sense of time or timelessness or whatever you want to call it, in an ancient world kind of context. I mean, even as an interesting example, so when we talk about the concept of eternity or forever, in Hebrew language and in Hebrew thinking, eternity or forever actually has an end. They can't seem to conceptualise. They couldn't seem to conceptualise this idea of something that just goes on forever without any. Well, I'm sure we can. But they actually have language to specifically say, forever to this point, like we might say forever and ever. But for us, that means it goes on and on. But in Hebrew language, it's sort of forever until we get to that point. And that's the end of forever. So it's a different world view. We need to take that into. Like I said, they were ancient people writing ancient texts, not ancient people with some kind of modernist view of science, the things that we now know. The other example, of course, this example, is the flat Earth. They did not have the concept of a spherical Earth, and that makes total sense to me. That reflects the ancient Eastern context. And God didn't override that. And I think there's very good reason for that. John Morling, who's an Old Testament theologian, uses this, he describes it this way. And there are many examples we could give. He talks about the way in which God condescends to human understanding. He's not using condescending there in a pejorative sense, but the idea that God speaks and relates and communicates to humans on our terms in ways that we can understand. So an example of that would be the form of covenant that was given to Israel on Mount Sinai is just a stock standard Suzerain vassal treaty. You can see thousands of them in excavations of the ancient world. They're not unusual, they're not strange, they're not amazingly spiritual or incredibly inspired. They're just ordinary, everyday, like what we might call a contract. So God goes to him. God condescended. God said, well, I want to form a relationship, establish a relationship with these people. And so the way I will do it is through a cultural form that they understand. Which says something about God, doesn't it? It says something about the way God works. It says something about the way God relates to humans. Yep.
Creation story we share with Jewish people and Muslims and Christians. Will they say it's similar or very different?
2 Jews, 3 opinions? So it depends who you ask. Yeah. Look, I think it's reasonable to say that it's a tricky one because biblical scholarship and theology in Judaism is really quite different to what it looks like in the Christian tradition. I don't think you would find many Jewish scholars who would read the creation accounts as literal historical. They would read it as allegory. They would read it as imagery, as theology, the sort of thing I've talked about. But again, yeah, and look, to be honest, they wouldn't place as anywhere near as much significance on that as some Christians do. I mean, because obviously, and then read some here tonight as well. I mean, while I think they're really the creation stories are foundational and really important, some would say, well, the historicity of those accounts, the theology is contingent on historicity, if that makes sense. So if they're not, if they can't be taken historically and literally, then they can't be of theological value. Whereas I would argue that the theological value transcends any view of how you actually read the how of creation. I think most Jewish scholars, but honestly, in Jewish scholarship, discussions like I've seen in the Christian context just don't exist. The discussions in Judaism are about, as I again often find myself saying, the key question in studying the scriptures, which is one of the Torah in Judaism, the key question is how then shall we live? It's an ethical question. It's not a question of being, I'll probably caricature here, but in some Christian context, it's how then shall we live? So what are the important things? We need to believe the right things. I'm not saying doing that in more than ethics, but it's just a matter of emphasis. Whereas in Judaism, I'll go on a limb here and I'll say it's probably not important to believe the right things, but it's really important to live the right way. I think that's just a recognition of all different things in ways. That's the reality of how humans experience.
Yeah, maybe following on from your statement that it's not so much part of what we believe, but how we live. It seems to me you were saying you started off with the literal interpretation of Genesis because you're your mother and being a child. Not all, and you've gone on to see how understanding the culture in which we live in, how who the importance were and literary forms lead you to different conclusions. If as a 21st century white male in Australia, I don't have that scholarly understanding that you gain from years of experience. I might approach Genesis literally. If I don't have the understanding of the New Testament scholar of what it's like to live in a first century Jewish diasporic community, so I don't understand the writings. What does it mean for the average Christian? How does God speak to them through Scripture if they don't have necessary knowledge to interpret Scripture?
Yeah. It's a really good question because a lot of people in our churches and a lot of people who are interested in the Bible who come more from a lay perspective, obviously, and get that background. I suppose two things I'd say there. One is that you can still appreciate the theology of the text, however you read it, in terms of literal, historical, angle terms. I guess what concerns me, and I'll give you an example of a friend, someone I grew up with actually, who for a long time has been very interested in Genesis creation accounts, but in the mechanics of creation. And reading Genesis as a description of the mechanics of creation. And we were having a whole conversation at one stage, and I said to him, what about the theology of those stories? And he said to me, I never thought of this. I never thought that the theology was espoused in those stories. That really disappointed me, because I thought, here's a person who's devoted themselves to reading the text and trying to understand it, but they've not, for whatever reason, they've missed the theology. So I think he's an exception, because I've also talked to people who've done the same thing and had the same perspective as him, but they can appreciate the theology that's there as well. This is the things that I was talking about. So I think it's about expanding people's appreciation of the text beyond what it literally says. I mean, I think that would apply to all of Scripture, actually. Because I think if you want to read it, I'm using the word literally, it's a tricky word as well, but if you want to read it literally, I think it can limit the understanding.
Yeah, I just wonder how often the Christian community as a whole gets the wrong end of the stick because we don't have that knowledge of how to interpret Scripture. There's all sorts of things that St. Paul says have been literary. Homosexuality is a sin and it leads to death. Water should be shot on in the church and wear a head covering because of the angels. There's all sorts of things that we would say if you read that literally. Oh my goodness. How many things are widely accepted in the church today where if we actually had a better understanding of what was Paul's intent when he wrote the letter, who were the recipients, how would they have taken it? What is the theology? Right? How different would Christian culture be today?
Well, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's one of the reasons that institutions like this exist, to try to help people explore that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, and this is probably more common in the evangelical churches, I guess, is that we do sometimes have preachers who are not trained theologians. And I have a very strong conviction about training in theological education for the very reasons that you were talking about. Because if pastors, if people who are preaching and teaching, if they're not aware of this context and background and these kinds of things, then how will people ever think about that? And I mean, just the comment, I've made that comment about the Garden of Eden, what was outside the Garden of Eden. And I've sometimes made that comment in a Bible study or setting like that. And thinking people go, oh, can you say more about that? Oh, that's really interesting. But I had to have that thought from somebody to ask the question. And I think as we were saying, that people often don't even have the thought because no one's ever got to think about those sort of things. Yeah, so I think, I think it's incumbent on our preachers and our teachers to actually know this context and background stuff. And I think you're right. I mean, again, I'll go out and link you, but I think in some respects, and I'm generalising as well because I can't speak for the whole church, but in the context I'm involved in, some things would be done differently, I think, if we understood the context and background of some of the things that we use in life in certain ways.
But I'm thinking from the current age in which we live, there's so many resources available through the apps. I have the concordance. I can look up Hebrew, even though I don't know Hebrew, but if there is a word, we can all do that. And there is so many commentaries from the Bible. So, and the most precious thing is that we have is the Holy Spirit, because He's our teacher, He's our guide. He interprets, He highlights things. He makes it personal for us, what it means to us. So we cannot afford to depend. Yes, there is a value of having preachers and people who are trained in the ministry, but in our personal walk with God, we cannot afford to depend on the preachers and the teachers.
It's a both end. It's not an either or.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to say. And don't interpret my comments as suggesting that all of our understanding of Scripture and understanding of theology is reliant on a particular person or particular people. It always will be. I mean, we need to acknowledge that for any of us that read the Bible in English, we're actually reading a translation which is reliant on an enormous amount of scholarship and academia. I mean, the work that goes, I couldn't even begin to describe the work that goes into forming an English translation. So the very fact that you read a Bible in English, you are automatically relying on a huge body of scholarship and learning. So we all stand on the shoulders of others. That's the nature of Christian faith. And yes, it's a both end. And I think also, and this is a tricky one as well, because we in Western society we live in individualist societies. So what you were expressing before, the idea of God speaks to me by the Holy Spirit, and helps me to understand Scripture. Yeah, agree. But a collectivist society would say, actually, God speaks to us. And we need to, in order to see God, the most important thing is we listen to one another. And it's actually in community that we've got. One of the sayings we have around here, which we often use, is the best theology is theology done in community. So not the person who just goes off and does it on their own, but the person who can listen, ask questions and contribute, and it's that conversation that makes for a very good theology. So it's both things.
Just wondered, round about what time did the language become written? You know, Hebrew becomes written language, roughly. Because I mean, you know, the prophets must have written. I mean, there's that story about the fellow who he read a piece and he put it in fire, and read a piece and put it in fire.
In German.
I mean, sure, they had writing at that stage.
Yeah. Well, the earliest material evidence we've got, I think, goes back to about 1000 BCE. Like, it's just a fragment. It's not a whole scroll. The earliest body of work we've got for the Bible would be the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they date from about 150 BCE.
Yeah, I wasn't concerned about, you know, physical evidence, because obviously, but I guess, you know, there must be other ways of working out when they started to write or not. I mean, from the text itself, I mean, surely Jeremiah then was writing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the story makes no sense at all.
Yeah, well I think when we're talking about biblical books, I think we need, and particularly the prophets, we need to distinguish between the historical character and the book. So there's Jeremiah, and then there's Jeremiah's book. And Jeremiah's book is heavily redacted, so it's quite varied. And if you look at that's a great example. If you look at Jeremiah in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew, and put it alongside the Septuagint, the Greek translation, they're totally different things. They're in different orderings. There's stuff missing in one that's in the other and not in the other. So it almost seems like there were two traditions of Jeremiah. First and Second Samuel is very much the same as well. So I think the best we can say is that stuff was written down, but like we were saying before with the creation account with NMR leadership, seemed to be formulated into a written form. The consensus, well, this is a progressive consensus, not a conservative consensus would say that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, you know, and did it back in his time. But a progressive sort of perspective would say that it was probably all written down in the post-exilic period. It began in the Kings, the period of the Kings, so David and Solomon, but it was finalised in...
Right, yeah, so I'm more concerned when it began, you know, when you actually had... So, for instance, I could ask a tricky question.
Yeah, they're all tricky questions.
What language would the tablets have been written in, or, you know, is that sort of...
But some form of Proto-Hebraic. So there is some material evidence of Proto-Hebraic. So it's like original, like an ur-text kind of thing. It's an original text of Hebrew, which you can see as Hebrew, but it's not the same Hebrew as what the Masoretic text is. So, but if you ask me a question like what language did Moses speak, I don't know, Egyptian probably.
Yeah.
I think we had one.
Well, that was I was just highlighting the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
I'm interested in, you mentioned that you do, theology it happens in community here. And what you're talking about is that theology is, the texts are theology, they're theological reflections. I'm just wondering about, as a science, people acting in the real world, how we think theologically in our time and place, given the ethical dilemmas and the struggles and the culture that we're currently in, and how we do meaning making. And I guess what I'm hearing is, in one sense, a bit of permission giving from the scriptures that's what's always been happening. And culture has always been meaning making. So, and I was thinking about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and the epics to try and make sense of the world wars that they were living in, the battles and all that sort of stuff. And just any thoughts about that might happen in the 21st century and scientific culture with without the mysticism and spirituality that perhaps other cultures have had to deal with that.
Well, I think one of the things we can do is there's a habit in Christianity, I think, to want to domesticate the text. Like we want to train the text like we train a dog to behave how we want it to behave. But we need to free the text and let the text be whatever it is, and it'll be different things to different people. I think, having a perspective that's open-ended rather than closed-ended, so we don't have to come to a definitive answer on every point. Some of the things you guys before. So there are some things we just don't. We can sort, we can look at context, we can look at language, but there are some things that we probably never understand. It takes a long time. But in terms, look, I mean, in terms, and I'm not a scientist, but I think we have to take what we now know about the world seriously, and where it appears to be in opposition to what we read in biblical text. Well, we then have to appreciate that it was written by people who didn't have that same scientific perspective. They didn't have a scientific perspective. And really ask the fundamental question, what were they doing? They weren't writing science. They weren't even writing history. I've had historians that I've had in my classes over the years, history professors, who say if you read the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew scriptures, even the New Testament, as an historian, you are incredibly disappointed because it's just not history. And that's not, they're not speaking disparagingly of the text, they're just saying, what are we reading? It contains history, but we're not reading any history. What are we doing? We're reading theology. So I would want to say, in that sense, let science do what science does, and let the scriptures do what they do, and there'll be some overlap, but in some senses they're both doing different things.
I guess my question is more about how do we assign those? How does science think theologically, put it into practice? Like how do we bring that around ethics and the sense of people's identity and the future of robotics and all those sort of things, like increasing, building on.
I'm not sure.
I think it should be value adding.
Yeah.
Value to the science. Rather than go, I am actually doing two different things. But how does it add value to?
Yeah. Well, I think where it does add enormous value is in the area of ethics. So, Vicky Lauren, for example, who's a graduate who has been working in what's the human enhancement technology? Yeah, in the ethics area. And I think that's, we have a lot to say. I'm going to say we, from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective, we have a lot to say about the ethics of various things in science. Ethics, any form of science is going to raise ethical issues. And I think part of the key is thinking about these ethics before they present. So you've got an idea of how you're going to deal with it rather than dealing with it on the above. So I think that's one way, the ethical realm. I guess my point is if we're trying to get the Bible to address scientific issues, it's not going to happen. It's not, because it wasn't written for that purpose, and it was written at a different time anyway. So, yeah. I also want to say, and again, I say this as a non-scientist, so forgive me for that, but we also have to say that science will go a certain distance. Theology will go beyond that. So I'm thinking, and again, I'm a total layperson in this regard, but I'm thinking of some of the reading I've done in the area of physics, where it strikes me that some of the philosophizing in physics that has happened is almost it's moving into the realm of philosophy, and we might argue theology, but I don't think physics as a science has the language for that, whereas philosophy and theology does. Doesn't mean one's superior to the other. They're trying to talk about the same thing but in different ways. And those of you who are physicists, know a lot more about that than me. But I guess my point in response to what you're saying is that if the theologians and the physicists could come together and talk about that, then maybe they would find that the physicists would go, okay, so that helps us to make more sense of what we're seeing. And theologians could say that helps us to make more sense of what you're seeing. So we get a better sense of it.
Could I just add as a physicist that that's actually happened in physics a lot. So George Lemaitre, who actually came up with the idea of the Big Bang, was a Catholic priest, and a big part of him thinking that the world had a beginning was his faith, and saying that, and everyone else, all the other physicists thought that the world was eternal, and that was the most beautiful form of the world. And so, in that sense, he didn't use creation account to justify that belief, in the sense that it wasn't sort of describing exactly what happened, but for him, the fact that there was a beginning was completely coherent with his view of what he saw in the cosmos and what we have found to be very consistent. So
That's interesting. Yeah.
it inspires, I would say.
Yeah. And I guess that's a great illustration that I was trying to explain, the idea of the physics and theology coming together to enhance one another, as part of the concept. I mean, just on that, I mean, and I guess for me, a lot of what we're talking about comes back to the language of the language of the Bible. And going back to your comments, part of the problem I think we have, this links to my comments in response to you about we read translations that are based on a lot of scholarship. But translations push us to understand and interpret things in certain ways. So, as an example, Genesis 1:1, in most modern English translations, is translated as, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That is not the best way to translate that verse. The JPS translation, this one here, the English translation, actually translates as when God began to create the heavens and the earth, which is it's actually a different place to translate. I'll give you that. It's a better translation to translate it that way. You would never translate it like this, but the best way to translate it is when God began the creating of the heavens and the earth. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear it that way, that gives me a different vision of what happened back then, whenever, it's a Big Bang or whatever it was, that this was the beginning of a process that will unfold, rather than that very more static vision of, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, all that comes back to how you translate Bereshit, first word in the Hebrew. So it goes back to your question. So, how do people become aware of that unless they study Hebrew, do theology? Well, again, I guess it comes back to my comments before that we need to be relying on commentaries, we need to be relying on preachers who are trained, teachers who know what they're talking about. And, to be blunt, those are too blunt, but, if I've got an electrical problem in my house, I don't call a preacher to fix it up. I call an electrician, unless it's smart or she's smart. And so, so when I'm listening to someone preaching or reading something, I expect that they have training. I'm not suggesting that answers everything. Like I said earlier in my presentation, it doesn't be infallible by any stretch, but it does give the person a certain level of knowledge and expertise. Now, unfortunately, not all of us can have the opportunity. That's the reality. We can't be electricians, we can't be theologians, we can't be musicians, but we can appreciate those who have expertise in those areas. That's the problem. Yeah.
Most people read the first statement, the heavens and the earth, and think, the earth, heaven is outer space.
Yeah.
But it's, again, going back to people who were in Rome, was reading this no concept of what outer space meant, what reality was, or the vastness of it. So it's possible that really what they're saying is, in the beginning, God created the spiritual realm, the heavens for them, and the material realm. And that could be another way of looking at that statement.
Yeah. And just to make it totally non-scientific, God also created this beaten out plate, like the middle of the two. It's a solid plate, which doesn't actually exist.
It's solid plate.
A solid plate.
An
expanse in the that separates because the ancient world to hold that.
So you had to keep the waters, the eternal waters, because the gods were on top of the water.
Yeah, so just to say the spiritual realm. So the heavens could have been, they would have easily seen the heavens as the spiritual realm, as distinct from the earth, the material realm.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. Yeah. I think the other thing, just to say too, I think this comes back to language, but if you again, if you're looking at the Hebrew there, it's very interesting. So the Hebrew verses, there's indications of how to break the verse. So the reading of that verse is actually Bereshit bara Elohim, which is translated as when God began the creating the heavens and the earth. So the emphasis really in the Hebrew is not on the heavens and the earth. The emphasis is on this is the God who began the creating. Oh, by the way, it was the heavens.
What was the translation that you were quoting for when it was saying instead of God began, but
The Japanese, Jewish.
Japanese?
So, which is a little bit translation. I mean, like any translation, it has some issues, but it's pretty beautiful.
That upside down.
Say again?
You're holding that upside down.
It's the,
Okay.
it's the English way of holding it. But,
Okay, so you're then.
yes, it's got the, it's quite good, it's got the Hebrew on one side and the English on the other side. Yeah. So, can I just make one final comment?
Yeah, we are out of time.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
And this relates back to some of the responses I had to you. Please don't interpret what I'm saying as the Christian faith. What's necessary for Christian faith is to have some kind of esoteric knowledge that only comes through studying theology. That's what we call Gnosticism. It was, seriously, that was a serious movement yesterday for some. What I'm saying is that this level of knowledge, this level of expertise, can deepen, potentially deepen a person's appreciation of the text of actually saying. And as you were saying before, can potentially correct errors that we make in misinterpretation. So, but it's about a conversation. And we need to listen to one another. And obviously we need to listen to God. We need to hear the Holy Spirit. It's all part of that process. But it's a conversation that involves many parties.
Well, thank you. And that's a sort of segue into this ISCAST in general, because ISCAST is about conversations between science and Christian faith. So, and this was a fantastic one. So, thank you very much.